everyone, and thank you all for joining the program today. I'm Rita, the American Spaces Director at the U.S. Embassy, Ghana, and I'm working together on this program with my colleagues, Andrew, the American Spaces Outreach Coordinator, and Asheville, the American Spaces Assistant. American Spaces provides access to current and reliable information about the United States through book collections, internet access, and events and activities for everyone. Normally, we will be meeting face-to-face, either at our American Center at the U.S. Embassy in Accra or American Corner in North Legon to have such a program. But due to the global pandemic, our spaces are temporarily closed. The good news, though, is that through virtual programming, we are able to reach beyond Accra. And as let me also take the opportunity to mention that because of virtual programming, we have a speaker for today speaking all the way from the US on this topic. We'd love to know where everyone is viewing from. Let us know which region or which country you are tuning in from in the chat box. In the US, the month of February is dedicated as Black History Month to highlight African American history. And as part of activities to commemorate this year's Black History Month, we are going to have a presentation followed by a discussion with Dr. Agya Boakye-Boaten on the topic Civil Rights in the US, an overview of the 1950s through 1960s. During the session, please type all your comments or questions on the session in the chat box. Dr. Boakye-Boaten is a U.S. food rights scholar, University of Cape Coast, Ghana, from 2019 to 2020. Due to the COVID, he had to leave early. He's a Kennedy Fellow, African Diaspora Fellow, also Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration, Ghana 2017. In addition, he is an international scholar as a lifelong member of Phi Beta Delta Honor Society. His research interests include alternative education for street children, modern day slavery, building intellectual and creative capabilities of students, using alternative education strategies, and the use of education as a medium for the promotion of democracy. Furthermore, he is interested in the colonial options, construction of African philosophical thought, effects of colonialism on Africa aesthetics, and the transformation of indigenous cultures through global engagement. Currently, he is an associate professor and chair of the Interdisciplinary International Studies Department at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. So, welcome, Dr. Boakye-Boaten. Please, all of you join me in welcoming Dr. Agya Boakye-Boaten on the floor today to give us this wonderful presentation to educate us on civil rights in the US from the 50s to the 60s. Thank you, Dr. Boakye, for coming.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rita, and I appreciate your generous introduction of me. Thank you all for coming to this presentation. For my friends in Ghana, I say good afternoon, Maha. And for my friends in the United States, I say good morning and welcome to this presentation for today. It is indeed a privilege to be here this morning to have this conversation with you. I call myself a storyteller, so I am going to tell a story today. And I'm going to tell a story about the civil rights movement in the United States, which culminated in a mass movement for the liberation of Black folk in the 1950s and 60s. But I want to tell this story not from a space or a narrative of people that have been projected to be a people that only survive in struggle. I want to have this conversation with you to highlight, most importantly, the triumph in the face of adversity of a people that were designated non-human by European imperialist expansion project. Now, it is important that I frame this in a way that accentuates the capacity and capabilities, and we tell the story of Black people across the globe. This is what I call global Africa, across the globe, not from a standpoint of deficit, but a people who were robbed of their potential, but in spite of that, continue to excel in all facets of our human endeavor. And so I would, with your permission, I would like to share my screen so that you can go along with me as I do this presentation. Let's see here. There we go. So I'm sharing my screen with you. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay.
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So, before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of this program, particularly the public affairs section of the U.S. Embassy in Ghana. I would like to particularly thank Mr. Awuku, Mr. Archibald, and of course, Mr. Andrew, for all the work that they've put in making this possible. What is mostly exciting to me today is the cross-Atlantic conversation. I know we have folk here who have personally experienced the obnoxious policies of racial segregation in the United States. We have here on this call descendants of Africans who were enslaved and forcibly brought to the United States as enslaved. And so I am particularly grateful to all of you for being here and experiencing this conversation with other folks, mostly my Ghanaian folks who may not have a very deep and intimate knowledge about the struggles of Africans in the United States. And so any opportunity to bring this dialogue for global Africa together is very important to me. Now, before I start, I would like to pay homage to our ancestors. I would like to pay homage to our ancestors, those who paved the way for us to be here today, those who laid their lives on the line to create a path for us to be here today. And so if you will indulge me, I would like us to go into a minute of silence in remembrance of our ancestors who, through their blood and toil, we are here today to tell the story of the triumph of Africans. A minute of silence, please. Thank you. So let's start the story. Let's start the conversation here today. I want to start by emphasizing that the African story is not a story of deficit. The global story of Africans is a global story of triumph. And so when Carter G. Woodson instituted February as Black History Month, it was in recognition of the celebration of Blackness as excellence that most narratives about Africans across the globe has been narratives of Africans from a deficient standpoint, that Africans had contributed nothing to this modern European project. But when Africa was thriving, Europe had gone dark. This is important to state, so that our story is not a story that has been fed to us by the Europeans. Our story is a story of constant excellence and triumph in the face of adversity. And so I want all folks to acknowledge that the cataclysmic conditions that brought us into the European modernity project was not the story of the African. The story of the African happened long time before the fatalistic encounter between Europe. And so if we start our story using European temporalities as the basis of our definition, then we would always be speaking from a space of deficit. So I want us to frame this, that Africa, before this encounter, this fatal encounter, had very sophisticated cultures, including elaborate social structures, systems of governance, advanced economies, and artistic forms that were the envy of the world. And then came the 15th century, when Europe decided to expand. In this expansionist project, Africans were placed in a dehumanizing condition. So when Europeans encounter Africans, Europeans did not take into cognizance the African story of existence, the African strength, the Africa's contribution to the world. Indeed, the first human civilization started in the African continent. So how come Africa's story becomes subordinated to the European expansionist project? Now, I cannot talk about the civil rights until I highlight why it became extremely necessary. And so, just to frame it, the civil rights movement in the United States, it's a collective of massive political action, social action, economic action that sought to liberate Africans in the United States towards the quest for freedom. That if the American experiment, the American idea, was that all men, and I will include all women, are created equal, that all men and women are endowed by their creator, then our practices should reflect the very foundational idea of America. And that has been the utmost fight for African Americans till date. And I want to emphasize that, sometimes temporalities makes it confusing a little bit. But most importantly, the civil rights movement started way before the 1950s and the 1960s. The move for equality, the move for restoration of Black humanity started in the dungeons of the Cape Coast slave castles. It started in the dungeons of the Elmina slave dungeons. It started on the slave ships that ferried millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. It manifested in the Haitian independence agitation. It manifested in the several uprisings that Africans in the United States fought to extricate themselves from the obnoxious, peculiar institution of slavery. And so all of this culminated in forcing the United States to live to its true ideals, that all peoples created by God would have these inalienable rights. I cannot get over this word, that your right is bestowed to you by God who created you. And so African Americans have never been asking permission to be free. They have been asking the system to not prevent them from liberty. Your freedom cannot be granted by a human being. Your freedom is granted to you by God. But humans try to deprive you of your freedom. And that in and itself was just what the movement, mass movement, was about. So let's look at this American idea, which is enshrined in the American Constitution with the Emancipation, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in the preamble of the American Constitution, it said all men, which probably literally meant that all men, all white men, all men that own property, are endowed by their creator with these rights that cannot be taken away by another human being. But white men who drafted these words did not believe them to be true for hundreds of thousands of Black people who were enslaved at the time. So that when we say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that did not apply to thousands and hundreds of thousands of Blacks who were toiling in the dangerous plantations across the United States. Yet, despite being violently denied the freedom and justice that was promised to all, this is important, Black Americans have fervently believed in the American creed. They have fought to believe and ensure that we go towards a perfect union, however that is defined, which simply means that all men, all women are created equal. And so, what does that mean? To be created equal and yet exist in a form of institutionalized dehumanization. So, you know, slavery in the United States was not like slavery everywhere else. I mean, you know, the transatlantic slavery was not the only slavery in the world. There had been several. In fact, most societies had some form of servitude. The difference with the transatlantic slavery for the first time was that slavery was not conditional to your status, as maybe you don't have much money, you don't come from a ruling class. Your hue became the condition for slavery. Your color became the condition for slavery. So that if you were Black, in the early stages of the formation of the society, your status was perpetual slavery. And that for generations of Black folk, they were born into the system, their children were enslaved. And so you were born, if you were a slave, you had children, your children were born enslaved. So that enslaved people were now recognized as human beings. Chattel slavery meant that they were owned. You had no human agency, that your humanity did not matter. They were sold and bought as property. There are many accounts of the slave auction block. It's almost like how they sell cattle. You bring human being there, you strip the human being naked, you examine the human being, and you put a price on the human being. That was how life was for many Africans who came into this very brutal encounter. And so the system created a network of laws and customs, astounding for both their precision and cruelty, that ensured that enslaved people would never be treated as such. So that there were laws for humans and there were laws for non-humans. And in this case, the non-humans were Africans who were forcibly brought here to enslave and work to build this nation. So when Jefferson and his cohorts are talking about freedom and liberty did not extend to those they considered not fully human. And you had to create systems in place to justify the treatment of Africans as non-humans. Folks, this is the reason why I don't even call it civil rights anymore, because they were fundamental human rights. Your right to existence was dependent on the benevolence of another person. Your right as a human being was stripped completely from you. I mean, you existed as if you had no soul. And in all these undertakings, there were ample legal, moral, spiritual, religious justification that instituted the idea that these humans were not human when you brought them in contact with the Europeans. Europeans were humans, Africans were non-humans. Europeans were good, Africans were bad. Europeans were Christians, Africans were non-Christians. Europeans were masters, Africans were enslaved. A Manichaean world, which literally divided the world into two between the good and the bad, defined in the eyes of Europe. And so in the United States, we can talk about eventually there will be emancipation, there'll be the 13th Amendment, which I'll talk about it in a few, but the United States created laws that enshrined the idea that if you were of a particular hue, you were a particular color, you were not human enough. And so one of the most striking laws, which we call Dred Scott, and when you hear the word dread, you dread about something, and the name is Dred Scott in 1857, ruled that whether enslaved or free, that's a Black person, whether you were enslaved, whether you were free, you still came from a slave race. And so this institutionalized the inferiority of Black folk to white folk. And therefore, if you are a slave, therefore, if you're not human, therefore, if you do not have agency, then you cannot enjoy the benefits of democracy. The laws of protection, the laws of acquisition, the laws of recognition, the laws to seek redress, the laws to have protection, equal protection under the law, was not applicable to you because you come from a slave race. And to come from a slave race means you were Black. And if you were Black, means you were not human. And if you were not human, then the laws of the land, which is promulgated to the protection of all citizens of the land, you could not benefit from those laws. Let that sink in for a second. So that the Negro race, the called rule, was a separate class of people, not regarded as a portion of the people or citizens of the government, had no rights, which a white man was bound to respect, which included the fact that your right to existence was nothing to the white person, was nothing to the European. And so if Black people could not be citizens, if they were cast apart from all other humans, then they did not require the rights bestowed by the Constitution. And the we, in the we, the people, was not a lie. We, in the we, the people, was not applicable to the Africans. Because everything that was enshrined in the Constitution for the protection of the human was for the protection of the human. But then we built a society to classify a whole group of people as non-humans. And if you are non-human, then the human laws do not apply to you. This was the basis that the civil rights movement needed to correct. The civil rights movement needed to bend the arc of morality back to the humanity of the Black person. It is unfathomable to have people here in the United States who were brought to struggle for the struggle stripped of their humanity. Now, you know, our laws do not apply to you. You're not human. But then times begin to change. Amongst the many agitations, because slavery did not die, because, you know, white folk eventually found that it was really bad that we had to end it. A whole war was fought for it. The country was divided. One half of the country decided that it was their inherent right to keep a group of people subordinated, subjugated, enslaved. And so they would not want to give it up. Civil war was fought. But eventually, as in all cases, right always wins. And so slavery eventually was abolished in the United States in 1865 through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, it is important to think about this, because slavery was abolished per the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. But if you read the 13th Amendment very well, it also permitted the servitude. You could still enslave people based on if they broke certain laws. I'm coming to that, because slavery was abolished, stopped. In the United States, it was still happening in Brazil. So over 20,000 folks from the United States, particularly in the South, just white folk just packed their bags and went down to South America to engage in plantation slavery there, because it was still ongoing. But this is important, because after slavery, although the Constitution was amended to say that you cannot hold any persons enslaved unless there was a condition there that they had committed a crime. So what else would you do? You had to create the crimes, create the conditions to continue the servitude and enslavement of Black folk. You know, this idea that now slavery was over and so Black folk were supposed to be free, maybe, but white folk were not ready to let that go, because they had established from the onset that these folks, Africans who were brought here, were not human enough. And if you've been stripped of your humanity, they are not going to grant you your humanity on a silver platter. You have to fight to restore your humanity. And that fight for the restoration of Black humanity is still ongoing. There's never been anything granted to Black folk without struggle, because at every juncture of this experience, There had to be a fight. So that it's important to know the role of freed blacks. Black freedom was not granted to them. They fought for freedom. I'm not saying white folk were not part, some white folk were not part of the struggle, but the struggle for liberation was part of the Black DNA. So slavery is dead. Emancipation Proclamation, all the atrocities that brought in slavery, that ushered in this very obnoxious, institutionalized dehumanization of Black folk was coming to an end. The period after the Civil War, we see the Reconstruction period. Many African Americans would begin to pursue liberty, justice under the law. If I am not slave, then I am free. If I am free, I should be a citizen. The 14th Amendment ushers in that. And to be a citizen of this country comes with certain rights. The quest for self-reliance, self-determination. But that was not going to be easy because white folk fundamentally believe that these folks were not deserving of freedom. Because look, if we have to understand the conditions of Black folk today, which is a tapestry of massive triumph. There's never been anywhere in human history that a group of people, I will put the time back, way back to the 15th century. That's where the encounter starts. The epic encounter between Europe and Africa starts in the 15th century. And so from the 15th century till the 21st century, the triumph of Africans is unimaginable in the face of massive institutionalized brutality against their persons. So if you see a Black person today, you know, you really ought to give them, tip of your hat to them, because they represent something here, which is not a story of misery, not a story of despair, but a story of sheer human survival, human triumph, human thriving in face of all adversities. And so the 13th Amendment would alter the configuration of southern states. The southern states in the United States economy was built on agriculture. And agriculture was built on the endless supply of free labor using Black bodies. And so with the end of enslavement, southern states did not have that access to free bodies to do their work for them. But they were not prepared to grant them this equality. They were not prepared to admit that they were humans. And so another period was ushered in. You know, there was some time of, you know, beautiful re-emergence, redefinition of Black humanity right after the Civil War. For about 10 years, call it the period of Reconstruction, you see Black excellence begin to emerge away from the shadows of slavery. But that was not gonna quiet the white folk, because they had built a society, a racial caste system, which had been ingrained in the institutions which promoted this idea that these Africans were not humans. And if you were not human, then we cannot treat you as human. We cannot allow you to benefit from the societal institutions that were promulgated for the protection of folks, of citizens. And so we begin to see a period of brutality and terror. One of the institutions that emerged in a position for the expression of Black humanity was the Ku Klux Klan, which operated outside the legal. It was an extrajudicial organization which meted out ushered in some of the most brutal period of violence against Black bodies after the Emancipation Proclamation in 65. And so we begin to see another form of racial institutionalized subjugation of Black bodies enshrined in the laws that African Americans who've been promoting the sense of self-preservation, working assiduously through the Civil War, through the Reconstruction, for simple, basic access to all that was granted to the citizens of the United States, that they can acquire land, that they could be part of the unions, that they could vote for their own representatives, they could be part of the voting process to expressing themselves politically, that they would have literacy for intellectual and artistic advancement. Remember, during the days of slavery, it was illegal to read. If you were caught reading or learning how to read, you would be punished severely. And so, for generations, for centuries, African Americans are beginning to see themselves, re-memory of what it is that they were before the Europeans came and collected them and ushered them into a brutal period of dehumanization. Because without land reforms, African Americans were free. We've held you in bondage. Now you're free. Where do you go? They had nowhere to go. And so they'll revert themselves. Okay, well, we're going to work for you. Well, yeah, you work for me, but I'll determine how much I'll pay you and all. And this, the period of Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau, all federal institutions, all federal policies that were put in place to restore the humanity of African Americans was locked shut 10 years after the Civil War. And most historians consider the period after the Reconstruction as an ultimate betrayal. African Americans would endure racism as the basis of American thought and processes. That this institutionalized idea of racial inferiority when it came to African Americans would now be enshrined in spite of the fact that they've been granted freedom, in spite of the fact that they've been granted citizenship. White folk will find a way to continue this racial caste system, which meant that African Americans will be completely deprived of access to some of the basic necessities for human existence. So that racism now becomes the way of life. The power of using one race as seeing one race as superior and the other race as inferior, and organizing societies based on this racial caste system. Who gets what, when, and how is dependent on your color. So that the progress that African Americans will seek to make will be constrained by this institutionalized racial segregation, exclusion from receiving opportunities that will be accorded to white folk. White folk had a set of rules and a set of resources ascribed to them. Black folk had a set of rules and no resources ascribed to them. At every juncture, we'll see institutionalized idea that these folks were not human enough. And if you're not human, then you cannot subscribe to human things. And so we begin to see the codification of laws, the black codes. The purpose of these black codes was to guarantee stable labor supply now that blacks were emancipated. They had these laws, including what they call the pig laws, vagrancy laws. If you were seen walking around and said, "Why are you walking here?" "Well, I'm just going to the store." That was against the rule. So your body itself became criminalized. The black body was synonymous to criminality. And this was all in the face of ensuring that there would be constant supply of resources. There will be constant supply of labor without compensation, labor without restrictions. So many were forced to become sharecroppers, tenant farmers. I know there are folks on this call that have experience with that, where you had to work for the white man to be compensated at the rate that they determined was good for you. Your whole existence was shrouded in your work. And most times you get into debt that you can never repay. And then, of course, the reign of terror will continue. We had what they call the convalescent system, very brutal suppression of black folk. So that part of the idea, remember, I've said before that the 13th Amendment, although it eliminated or abolished slavery, still made it possible for enslavement to continue, because if you broke the law, you could be subjected to the punishment of enslavement. That is working without compensation. And so prisoners were given, rented, or leased by the government to individuals. You talk about the building of railways, you talk about the work in the quarry. These were all prisoners, and you could get black folk for any reason. All you needed to do was to say, by walking on this street, you committed a crime, and so you go into prison and you go into work. There were lynchings to instill fear into African Americans. And you could be lynched for whatever reasons they were. So that from 1882 to 1968, over 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States. Out of these lynchings, over 3,000 of them were blacks. The white folk who were lynched during this period were white folk who may have assisted other black folk in their pursuit for freedom. And so if all we needed to do was say, you know what? We need this land. There's a lot of black folk here. Well, we're going to put a crime on you, and then we're going to threaten you with lynching, and then you just run away. And so this is the moment we begin to see the extension of the policies of enslavement, which is beginning to seep into the law in the continuation of the notion that black folk were not humans, or that they did not deserve to be treated as humans. And so by forcing Black folk to be lynched, or by forcing Black folk, by identifying Black folk or tagging them or classifying them as non-humans, to lynch them had no moral recourse. But most insidious of all this was the idea of segregation, racism, Jim Crow laws. And I'll define a little bit of what the Jim Crow laws are. That there was this idea that separate was equal, that Africans, white folk, remember, we had already established a long time ago under the Constitution of the United States that Black folk were not human enough, and so we could not accord them the same humanity as white folk. When we said all, they were not included in the all conversation. And if we say that we cannot enslave them, it doesn't mean we should live with them. And so because of the inferior status, we had to establish a racial apartheid system. This system of racial apartheid ensured that African Americans will continue to be in a subordinated state, that they deemed it impossible for these races to be mixing. And so we're going to create a social caste, racial caste, political caste, social caste, even religious caste system. You may be worshiping the same God, but you go to different churches. There was the white church and there was the Black church. And this, folks, it was not just simply separation. This separation was also economically strangulating. You were not simply deprived of your humanity, you were deprived of the opportunities to enhance yourself economically, to express yourself politically, to exist in your social conditions without subjugation. And so what are these Jim Crow laws? They originated in the song, this is the funny part, like, you know, my folks in Ghana would know about, you know, the concert parties and the exaggerated features of Incommodé and all those folks that will come on the concert party. Think about the concert party and then think about the white minstrel shows. And so this Daddy Rice comes in, covered his face in black charcoal. And then because they try to caricaturize the Black person. They gave the Black person exaggerated features, big lips, watermelon eating, everything to continue the conscious dehumanization. It was speculated in our societal consciousness. These Black folk were not humans yet. And so Jim Crow feature was a fixture of these minstrel shows. White folk would make up in Black faces and sing and mimic, you know, the buffoonery. And so when these strict laws were created, these laws, the segregation, racial segregation laws were created, they were classified as Jim Crow system. White only, colored only signs proliferated across the South. One of the saddest pictures I've ever seen is a fountain. White fountain, beautiful, Black fountain. That is where the dogs also drink their water from. And I'm thinking, like, what happened here? What is this visceral reaction of Black folk when they come into contact with whiteness? What is going on here of this immortal hatred for the other? Most times you don't even know the person. And so these laws became part of state and local laws. In the United States, you have state laws, part of the The 10th Amendment talks about some kind of semi-sovereignty of the state. And then you have federal laws, but most states would enact these laws that would racially segregate Black folk from white folk, of course, backed by law. In this landmark case in 1886, Plessy Ferguson, which says that, yeah, you can keep the races separate. Establishing a color barrier. And so everywhere you went, this is in Durham, North Carolina, a bus station where you have the colored folks and then you have the white folks. On the buses, white folks sat in front, Black folk were supposed to sit at the back. When a white person entered a bus and there was no seat and the Black person was sitting, the Black person had to give up the seat to the white person. They had ingrained in the society a racial caste system that was enforced through law to continue the dehumanization of Black folk. Irrespective of your social economic status, your Blackness would always define you. Then, of course, we have the Ku Klux Klan that I talked about a few minutes ago. This is a picture of the Ku Klux Klan parading, especially in the South. And most of these Ku Klux Klan folk, it was a violent terrorist organization. Folk, these were not nice people wearing white hoods and coming to your neighborhood to drink tea with you. These were folks who had institutionalized the terror against Black bodies. When they came to town, they sent some very sharp fear. They communicated fear. And then I'll highlight some few landmark cases. This case happened in down south. A young man, 14 years old, Emmett Till, lives with his mom in Chicago, goes down south in Mississippi to visit family. And the allegation was that he went to a corner store, bought some snacks, and the allegation was that he may have whistled to a white lady. That spurred on a hunt for this young man, decapitation of this young man, killed him, burned him out, put him in the sack, put center blocks around him to drown him in a creek. When he was found, his body was so deformed, but the mama decided that, you know what, I will still have an open casket. I want people to see the terror and brutality of whiteness against Black bodies. For a 14-year-old boy, what did he do? And so the case of Emmett Till becomes part of the galvanizing force against the mass movement for the dismantling of this racial policies, of this racial, legally instituted racial caste system. Because it was not just depriving Black folk from the resources that they have worked to build in this country. In fact, it was so injurious to the Black existence that if it had not been fought to be eliminated, the victims of such brutality would just keep mounting. One of the key moments in the civil rights movement was also the bus boycotts. There had been See, this is one of the things, and for my folks in Africa, you may want to remember the same similar agitations in South Africa, where in South Africa, there was a bus boycott. It was getting to Christmas time. It was a bus boycott. One of the scariest part of racial segregation built on market economies is losing money. And so when the bus boycott started, the white bus companies, the city councils now begin to lose money. If you hit racism at where it hurts more, which is that you begin to attack its economic base, that's the only time they listen. So this is Rosa Parks, arrested in Alabama for refusing to give up a seat to a white man. And this led to 381 days of bus boycott. They will arrest, cab drivers black cab drivers were trying to shuttle people up and down. They started arresting them. They started arresting the leaders of the boycott. Finally, Supreme Court said that this form of racial caste segregation was illegal in the famous case of Browder versus Gale. But then this did not stop, because it was still continuing. And so again, we see the Greensboro Four in 1960, 4 young kids, college kids from North Carolina A&T, go Aggie, went to the lunch counter in the Woodworth place, downtown Greensboro. It was segregated. Black folk could go in and buy food, but they could not sit at the lunch counter. And so these young boys decided, we have to break this. They want to take our green, they have to take our black, which is our body. And so they went, sat in the counter. It's very, again, when I experience this, I'm thinking about the visceral reaction that comes with black bodies in certain spaces. They were beaten, they were dragged, they were spat on. A host of violent reaction ensued. But this refusal to leave the counter, they returned every day, spurred on other protests in other parts of the United States. Now pressure was beginning to mount on the system. Massive movements were being organized across the United States. Marches, speeches, organizing, students, whether it was organizing black folk to register to vote, organizing for labor unions, organizing for economic activities, challenging the white system, the system that had placed Africans in the United States in some form of perpetual subordination, is now beginning to be challenged in the court systems. Because he said all of us have equal protection under the law. Now, if we do have equal protection under the law, then let the laws reflect these equal protection. That you cannot let my kids go to school in an all-black school with no resources, and your kids go to all-white school with all the resources. You have said, yeah, it's okay to keep them separate, just so long as you provide them with equal opportunity. But everybody knew that was not true. It was never going to happen. White folk wanted the exclusive white societies. They did not want black folk to be part of those societies. And the very basic fundamental idea was that blackness was viewed as an inferior race anyway. So if you are inferior, you do not have the capacity to be part of our human system. We see Martin Luther King leading the March on Washington, delivered this "I Have a Dream" speech. In that said, I want you to judge me by the content of my character and not by the color of my skin. Several such protests would take place along the South, including Bloody Sunday in Montgomery, Alabama, in Selma, Montgomery. And so we begin to see the system change through legal instrumentations. It's not coming from the states. The states are very locked in their ways of ensuring this racial caste system. So part of this agitation that started in the Cape Coast Castle dungeons with the protest of Africans begin to see legal instrumentations in the restoration of Black humanity after over 300 years. And so some of the most famous of these legislations that dismantle, this is important, dismantle de jure segregation and de jure racism, which means that legally you could not discriminate against someone based on your race, based on their religion, based on many other things. But you could not in your heart decide that I will love every person who is different from me. So even till date, although it's illegal to discriminate against anybody, we still see de facto segregation, de facto laws. You know, we just make it impossible for Black folk to afford to live in certain places. It's as simple as that. We just make it impossible for Black folk to attain certain qualifications. It's as simple as that. The law says I cannot discriminate against you, but the law never said I cannot, or I should love you, or I should like you, or I should provide you opportunities. I can find reasons to not allow you to do certain things because I still have the fundamental idea that your life is really not important. We saw here, and I'm about to end my story in a bit so that we can open up for questions. We saw here last summer in the United States the killing of a young man, George Floyd, that a police officer put the knee on his neck for over 8 minutes, suffocating this man to death while his hands were cuffed behind his back. Now, the question I ask folk is, did the policeman see this man as human? Did the policeman, for a smidgen of a minute, consider this young man as a person who had a soul? Did the policeman ever consider his knee on the neck of this person who is crying and begging to be freed? Did those cries sound like a cry of a human being to the policeman? And that spurred on some of the most intense mass protests across the country for justice, equal justice for all. That we still have a society which, for some strange reasons, still struggle to consider the humanity of Black people and consider Black folks as fully functioning humans who deserve the power and the recognition to be treated under the law equally. And these cries around the United States, in fact, was exported internationally. There were similar protests in Europe that Black lives indeed matter. But I want to end with this. The expression of Black Lives Matter evokes some level of delirium among certain white folk, that for some strange reasons, the expression of Black people in search of equal justice under the law, equal treatment under the law, for some strange reasons translate into some other folks' freedom being curtailed. So when you understand the basis, the violence that brought Black folk into this country, then you will understand the visceral reaction, the delirium that some folks in this country experience when Black folk are saying, I need my freedom. This delirium is rooted in the ideals of a society that was founded on the assumption that there were some folks who were not human enough. And this movement towards a much perfect union still continues. That until every single person is treated equally under the law, the quest for civil rights, the quest for human rights will continue. Until that, no human being will consider themselves superior and consider other folks inferior, this fight will continue. Until all humans are able to express their humanity without institutional constraint, this fight will continue. Until all of us can recognize the humanity of all, until all of us can recognize that we all are endowed by our Creator, until all discriminatory practices that continue to undermine the existence of certain people in the world are completely eliminated, this fight will continue. And so, as we celebrate or recognize February as Black History Month, remember that Black history is world history, that Black history is American history, that Black history exists 365 days in a year. The Black history is 24/7, because after February, we do not stop being Black. But at least we recognize the fact that we get this month to highlight the triumph of Black folk in the face of adversity, that we continue to we continue to excel and exude Black excellence in the face of adversity, that the contributions that Black folk have made to our world is enormous, and we need to recognize that. And so Black ain't going anywhere. Africans ain't going anywhere. African Americans ain't going anywhere. In fact, global Africa is on the rise, and we better be with the train or we go fall out of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boakye-Boaten, for such an excellent presentation. It's been so insightful. Thank you so much. We can't thank you enough for educating us this afternoon on civil rights in the US. It's been wonderful listening to you. It's been wonderful. We've learned a lot. I have learned a lot from you. And I believe that our audience have also learned a lot. We have a few questions. I want to say thank you as I start with the questions. And the first question is, what has been done to abolish laws that has ensured the mass incarceration of Black men in the US?
So it's a very complex issue that the mass incarceration, I can trace it back to the 13th Amendment. And a clause in the 13th Amendment which allows for Black bodies to be incarcerated and their bodies subjected to labor without compensation. Now, the law on its face does not seem racist, right? But the application of the law still do have intense racial connotations. And so I am not, if you criminalize, if the basis of US laws was promulgated on the criminalization of Black bodies. Now, if you do not decriminalize this notion of the law, then a lot of Black bodies will be caught into the process. Now, US incarcerates a lot of people. You know, the incarceration rate in the United States is pretty high amongst the developed nations in the world. And it's not that people there's a preponderance of folks getting into crime, but there are so many other social factors that contribute to this criminal system, so that the laws, in my judgment, are not applied equally. There is still so much racial undertones in the application of the law. There's so much has been written, right? We have the prison industrial complex. We have the school to prison pipeline, where the school systems are failing our children. There's been massive non-investment in urban communities. So basically, the laws of the United States have been shaped in such a way that it's easy for Black folk to be caught in the system, in the legal system, right? Now, for example, what creates wealth in the United States? The creation of wealth in the United States, a lot of families' wealth is invested in their landed properties, their homes, their other landed assets, right? For a very long time in the United States, Black folk were prevented from having access to government guaranteed loans to be able to purchase homes. And so if you are eliminated from the housing markets, although you passed the Housing Fair Act, you were eliminated from the housing market. Lenders will not lend you money. Relatives will not take you to desirable places. In fact, we have the redlining. There is a place where Black folk were not allowed to go and buy houses in there. Or if you got access to a mortgage, it was so predatory that eventually they will come and take your house. And so all these social factors have contributed to a society where treatment of people still are considered on racial terms. Now, many folk will say, well, we don't have racism anymore. Look, if you found a society based on racial caste system, if you do not dismantle that, it will still manifest in many aspects of the society. And so, there's no law which says that you should incarcerate all Black people, but the application of the law is so racialized that you get a disproportionate Black people being incarcerated than white folk.
Thank you. Thank you for that great answer. Awesome. Thank you so much. Doc, this afternoon we are learning a lot. We are learning a lot from you. One of our viewers also is asking about the 13th Amendment law. And she wants to know what were the other effects of the 13th Amendment? What were other, if you can tell us some of the other effects of the 13th Amendment?
So basically what the 13th Amendment, basically what it did was to outlaw slavery,
Okay.
make slavery illegal in the United States. But it also made provision for the enslavement of Black bodies if they were deemed to have committed a crime. And we are saying that based on that provision, a lot of Black folk were still caught in the criminal justice system. In fact, it's, the prison system, Blackmore has written a book called Slavery by Another Name. So the prison system, the concomitant effect of the 13th Amendment created an avenue for the continued enslavement of Black bodies. Now, I see a question here, somebody asking, what's the difference between slavery and human trafficking?
Okay.
The difference is that human trafficking happens when a person is either coerced, forced, taken from their home, from one, transported against their will, and then subjected to all forms of maltreatment. Now, slavery happens when the person or the being is not in charge of his or her own agency, that you are owned by another person. So whereas in human trafficking, you can subject people to very harsh forms of labor, very harsh forms of treatment, slavery is a total ownership of a person by another human being.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you for that wonderful answer. I guess we'll have to do our last question for want of time. And the question is, what would you say to a young person who shows apathy to his or her right to vote, considering the struggles of activists to ensure the attainment of such basic rights?
So voting is an expression of your constitutional right as a citizen of a country. And it is a sacred activity that is undertaken to ensure that all citizens have a voice in the governance of their society. It is for this reason that Black folk in the United States, all impediments were put in their way to prevent them from exercising that basic franchise, which would mean that they are bona fide citizens of a nation. So to vote is a solemn obligation of all citizens. To not vote is shirking your responsibility as a citizen and completely alienating yourself from the process of democracy. Voting is the engine of democracy. Voting is the sole preserve of citizens of a nation to be active participants in the governance process of their society. And so there might be other reasons why people don't vote, but I would tell every young person and every young person I come into contact with that democracy, the thriving of democracy is dependent on the citizenry to be active participants in it. Democracy can fail if citizens are apathetic to the processes that ensure the preservation of democratic ideals. And so you cannot be a part of a democratic society and a citizenry of a democratic society without exercising this very sacred solemn. And so I will tell all my folks, all my young people, when you attain the legal age to vote, please register to vote so that your voice can be heard. If you do not vote, others will vote and determine your existence in the society for you.
Thank you for that awesome answer. We've learned from that answer that everybody in whatever country you are, you have to exercise your right by voting so that nobody would vote and choose for you. Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you. Do you have a message you want to leave with us?
Yes, I would say thank you all for having me speak with you this morning. I will say that we need to recognize all our humanity as important, that collectively we protect each other and allow each other to live to their full potential by providing all the opportunities that we can for all people. Now, it is important that we change. This is my charge. It is important that we change the narrative of the Black person, of the African American as a person who exists in deficit. The contributions of Africans to the world has been erased, has been diminished, has been destroyed, and it behooves on us to retell the story, recorrect the record, change the narrative, because a people with no story is like a tree with no roots. A people with no understanding of their beginning is a people who are heading to nowhere. And I know that as we continue to imagine the new Black Renaissance, Africans everywhere will take pride in their Africanness, project themselves as people with agency, people who have roots. We need to go back and learn about what was Africa before Europe, right? We don't teach that. We don't want to know that. Because if we use the Euro narratives as the basis of our existence, then we'll always be talking about deficit. Now think about this. There are more Black people in the world than there are white people. So how come Black people are seen as minority and as inferior? It's because we are a divided people, and it is time for us to bond together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for that piece of advice, thank you so much. It is time for us to bond together. Thank you, Dr. Boakye-Boaten, for your time and wonderful insight on the history of civil rights in the United States. Thank you so much. Great information you've shared with us. And for our viewers from the US and all over the world, we say thank you. For our Ghanaian viewers, we say thank you. For all of you, we say thank you so much for this being with us. Thank you so much. And once more, I say thank you all for joining today's session. But before ending today's program, especially for our Ghanaian viewers, I would like to tell you about an online resource that you will find helpful. eLibrary U.S.A. It is a state-of-the-art digital library with 9 premier electronic databases that include digital newspapers, magazines, journals, videos, and dissertations. Usually, this resource is only available to use in person at the American Space or at the American Corner in Legon. But we are opening access to this amazing resource to the public because of the global pandemic. We are opening access to the public. If you are interested, you will see a link in the chat box. Please, it's a form, so you can just register, use it, complete it to register to receive login details to the databases. And that concludes our program today. Please follow us on Facebook. Follow us on our Facebook at U.S. Embassy Ghana for more exciting Black History Month virtual programs. Remember, due to the global pandemic, we've pivoted to virtual programming, and everyone is invited to join us on our programs. Please keep following us, register to participate in any of the programs you are interested in. Thank you once again for joining today's program. Until the next Black History Month program on Tuesday, February 9th, 2021, please stay safe, observe all personal hygiene protocols, practice social distancing, and remember to wear a mask in public.